What did a regular morning look like in 1975? No, I don't mean in the news, but on your street, in your home, or at your neighborhood park. Wait, did you know that in the mid-1970s, over 213 million Americans were living through a decade full of energy, struggle, and style? Yes, it was a time when disco ruled the dance floors, typewriters clicked in offices, and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. Morning in the 70s. What was the typical morning routine in America in the 1970s? You see, for most families, it began with a buzz, of course, not the type from smartphones, but from small alarm clocks with ticking hands and loud bells. Others were gently stirred awake by the familiar voice of the radio DJ, announcing the weather, the top news stories, or playing a soulful Marvin Gaye tune to ease people into the day. In the kitchen, the smell of hot coffee was the unofficial wake-up call for parents. Toasts would pop up from old toasters, and breakfast was quick but filled with cornflakes, or Cheerios poured into bowls, sometimes with sliced bananas or a sprinkle of sugar. For families with more time, eggs and pancakes might sizzle on the stovetop. Although it wasn't anything fancy, it was comforting. Moms, many of whom were still the primary caregivers at the time, moved through the kitchen with practiced ease since they do it all the time. They packed lunch boxes made of metal and decorated with images of superheroes, movie stars, or TV characters. The inside would be a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a piece of fruit, and maybe some crackers. Kids got dressed in outfits that now seem vintage but were the height of style back then. Corduroy pants, knee-high socks, plaid skirts, and knit vests were the order of the day. Hair was combed, shoes were tied, and backpacks slung over shoulders as they headed to school. Some waited for the bright yellow school bus, while others walked in groups, chatting, laughing, and occasionally dragging their feet. Outside, the world would have started rumbling to signify that the day had really begun. Cars pulled out of driveways. Back in those days, it was regular and almost routine for men in work shirts to kiss their kids goodbye. Some moms stayed home, while others buttoned up their blouses and headed to secretarial jobs, cashier stations, or factory shifts. The 1970s saw more women entering the workforce, changing the morning routine in many homes. Streets, music, and fashion. In the cities, neighborhoods were lined with brownstone buildings. To give a good idea, tall, narrow homes with stone steps where kids played and neighbors gathered were the usual. In the suburbs, freshly mowed lawns and two-car garages were usually in quiet streets, and each house was painted in pastel shades with wide porches and American flags. Small towns had their own pace, local diners, corner stores, and friendly faces that always said hello. The air itself carried the sound of the decade. Radios blared from open windows and car stereos, filling the streets with the deep grooves of soul music, the upbeat rhythms of disco, and the rebellious spirit of early rock and roll. The Jackson 5, Donna Summer, Fleetwood Mac, and the rest of them were the soundtrack of everyday life. On record players inside homes, people danced alone or in groups, letting music move them in a way that felt personal. And when it came to fashion, the streets were a runway. Bell-bottoms flared out over high platform shoes. Bright colors, bold prints, and wide collars were everywhere. Afros were the everyday hairstyle as they were a statement. From leather jackets and miniskirts to tie-dye shirts and denim everything, clothes were how people expressed who they were and what they believed in. You could tell a lot about someone from what they wore. Activists rocked army jackets and natural hair as a sign of protest and pride. Feminists embraced pantsuits and unisex styles as they challenged norms about what women should wear. Teenagers wore peace signs, fringe jackets, and beads influenced by the growing counterculture movement. It would, in fact, suffice to say, people weren't just dressing to look good, they were dressing to be heard. Daily life was also present in social spots like stoops, barbershops, and diners. Friends hung out on street corners talking about music, politics, or just the latest neighborhood gossip. Barbershops weren't just places for haircuts. They were hubs of community, conversation, and connection. In those days, restaurants were not this fanciful, and they mainly were called diners, where they served coffee and comfort food. Underneath it all, black culture was the heartbeat of American style and sound. From funk music to street slang, from braided hairstyles to dance moves, its influence was seen in everything, whether people realized it or not. Work life and daily grind. In the 1970s, work life in America was a mixed bag with part hustle and part routine. Whether in a buzzing office, a loud factory, or a quiet stretch of farmland, Americans rolled up their sleeves and got to work. In office buildings across the country, rows of desks filled large rooms. The hum of typewriters never seemed to stop, and the clack-clack of keys rented through the air like a steady rhythm. Secretaries and clerks answered phones with curly cords, flipped through filing cabinets, and typed memos on carbon paper. The smell of coffee blended with cigarette smoke, as back then smoking indoors was still normal. It was not uncommon to see ashtrays sitting beside staplers while a coffee pot was always brewing in the break room. Coffee breaks were more than just a chance to sip. There were moments to breathe. People shared stories, laughed about last night's TV shows, or chatted about weekend plans. These little pauses made the day feel more human. In industrial towns, factory floors buzzed with machinery. Workers in uniforms and boots punched time cards, operated assembly lines, and did physically demanding jobs with skill and pride. Many belonged to unions which fought for better wages, safety conditions, and job security. Union meetings were serious business, and strikes were a last resort, but they gave workers a voice. Outside the cities, farmers and their families worked from dawn to dusk as farming life was hands-on and constant. They feed animals, check crops, fix fences, and prepare for the next harvest. Another interesting thing is that children often pitched in before and after school, and it was not seen as child labor. It was a quieter life, but full of purpose and responsibility. Still, it wasn't always easy. The 1970s brought economic challenges. The oil crisis of 1973 sent gas prices flying up, and lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Inflation made groceries, clothes, and household goods more expensive. While prices rose, many people's wages stayed the same, and families had to stretch every dollar. Despite all this, people found joy in the familiar. They relied on routines of packing lunches, carpooling to work, and chatting with neighbors in the evening. Life didn't stop. People still danced on weekends, went to church on Sundays, and sat down together for family dinners. Without cell phones or the internet, staying connected took effort, but it was no less meaningful. People wrote letters by hand, sent postcards while on vacation, or picked up the home phone to hear a loved one's voice. Also, news traveled by word of mouth, local radio, or handwritten notes pinned to community bulletin boards. Work in the 1970s wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't always easy. But whether you were behind a desk, on an assembly line, or out in a field, you did what needed to be done. And somehow, between the paychecks, the people, and the simple moments in between, the daily grind became a way of life. Family, food, and fun. Dinner time was very important in many households. Families would gather around the kitchen table, often with a meal that was hearty, simple, and made from scratch. Meatloaf was a weeknight favorite, paired with mashed potatoes and green beans. Casseroles were a go-to for busy families, combining canned soup, pasta, and whatever was left in the fridge into one warm dish. It wasn't fancy cuisine, but it was comforting and filling. Inside the home, the shape of the American family was beginning to shift. More women were entering the workforce, juggling jobs and household duties. Gender roles, which were once rigid, started to bend. Fathers were pitching in more with chores or helping kids with homework. At the same time, divorce rates were rising, and single-parent households became more common. After dinner, it was time to relax. The television became the centerpiece of family entertainment. Kids flopped on shaggy carpets, and parents claimed the couch as shows like The Brady Bunch, Good Times, Sanford and Son. And all in the family filled the living room with laughter and conversation. These shows didn't just entertain. They showed social issues, family dynamics, and the culture of the times in a way that felt both humorous and honest. When screens weren't the focus, families and friends turned to simpler pleasures. Board games like Monopoly and Life brought out competitive spirits and belly laughs. Drive-in theaters were still popular as they offered a movie night under the stars from the comfort of a car. Church gatherings and community events also played a big role. Whether it was a Sunday potluck, choir practice, or a summer picnic, these moments helped people stay connected. For kids, life was full of freedom. They rode their bikes through neighborhoods, exploring every corner until the sun dipped low and their parents called them in. Supervision was minimal, but friendships ran deep. Whether building tree houses, playing stickball, or chasing ice cream trucks, childhood in the 70s was often unscripted, and that's what made it special. Voices from the margins. Beyond the mainstream picture of 1970s America, there were millions of people living stories that didn't always make the headlines, but were just as important. For Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, and immigrant communities, daily life held a different weight. It was a mix of struggle, survival, culture, and joy. In many cities, segregation hadn't fully ended. It just changed shape. Redlining kept neighborhoods divided, job opportunities were limited, and schools were often unequal. Racism was still very much around, from housing and policing to media and politics. Yet amid these challenges, communities built rich lives. Black families continued to deal with systemic barriers while raising kids, going to work, and creating influential art, music, and activism. The rise of the Black Power movement brought new pride and urgency to the fight for justice. Images of raised fists and afros weren't just political. They were deeply personal statements of identity and strength. Latino and Chicano activists organized marches, student walkouts, and community groups to demand better schools, fair wages, and immigration reform. From East LA to the fields of California, people spoke up and stood tall. Asian American families, many of them immigrants or children of war survivors, juggled old traditions with American life. They indeed faced stereotypes and exclusion, but they also built businesses, formed tight-knit communities, and contributed to the growing patchwork of American culture. For Native Americans, the 1970s were a time of awakening and resistance. The American Indian movement demanded land rights and self-determination, while everyday life on reservations and in cities showed generations that never considered giving up an option. The women's liberation movement and the gay rights movement also took hold. Though often centered in white urban spaces, these movements were built by people from all walks of life, like working-class women, queer people of color, single mothers, and even factory workers who knew that equality couldn't wait. Yes, the 1970s weren't a time when they had cool colors in their TVs or even their clothes, but they had it in their culture and every other thing that made the period beautiful. The best part is, they didn't even know they were lacking anything, because you can't miss what you don't have. Now tell me, which of these would you like to experience? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel.